Hello, I'm Ritula Shah. Welcome to this event from Agile UK. Welcome to people from all over the country and indeed all over the world. It's the second online event that Agile Rabbit's organised in partnership with the University of Exeter. I like to think of these events as sofa symposiums. And of course, in ancient Greece, where sofa symposiums, well, it had sofas, but they had symposiums, originally took place, they did involve the odd alcoholic beverage, but I leave that entirely up to you. There is, of course, because this is Zoom, a chat. Do use it to say hello. I can see some of you are already saying hello. Hello, Eric. Introduce yourself, where you're from, and tell us why you're interested in this particular topic. And just to let you know, there are more online events that are going to be organised by Agile Rabbit, and they'll be organising them soon. So go to the website, agile-rabbit.com, and you can find out all about it there. And Agile Rabbit normally puts on events in the southwest of the UK, in the southwest of England, and it explores ideas, global affairs, the natural world, the scientific world. And there are recordings of some of the events in the past on the website, and there are topics like how bats change the world and is my partner a psychopath? Well, that's a great question at a party, isn't it? Anyway, tonight we have a talk for 20 minutes followed by a discussion for a similar length of time. Again, please feel free to use the chat, to comment, to share links and resources, to ask questions. Do get involved. We really want this to be something that you can participate in. And yeah, if you ask questions, we'll try and fit them in towards the end as part of the event. And as ever, if you have technical issues, and my goodness, we all have technical issues, there is the on-off switch, isn't there? Try exiting the Zoom meeting and re-entering. It always works, I find. If not, you can private message Agile Rabbit here on Zoom and they'll try and help, or you can email contact@agile-rabbit.com if the problems persist. The event's being recorded, it's being streamed live, and we'll upload the recording to our website over the next few days. And whilst we're on, just keep your microphone muted and your video off so that we don't hear any extraneous noise. That's the housekeeping. Let's get down to why we're here. So today's talk is basically about universal basic income, which isn't a new idea. Its roots go back to the Charter of the Forest in 1217. And in its simplest form, it's the idea that everyone should be given a sum of money from the government, the same sum of money. It's universal and unconditional. I'm sure we'll talk about definitions, and there are a few later on, and it's not the only way of defining it. There have been trials of UBI or similar systems that have been put into practice, but governments have tended to step back from large-scale permanent implementation, and perhaps we can talk about why. During the coronavirus crisis, the concepts had renewed interest. 100 opposition MPs have signed a letter calling for a UBI. A YouGov poll that was published this week has shown that 51% of the public supports universal basic income, at least in this time of pandemic. And only yesterday, Nancy Pelosi in the States and Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, were both reported to be looking into the idea of a UBI. But of course, the Conservative Party doesn't support one. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has said he believes the existing welfare system is adequate. And the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, has said it's unlikely to be possible in this crisis. But they could be finding a firmer footing abroad. Earlier this month, Spain's economy minister, Nadia Calvino, told the broadcaster La Sexta that her government plans to bring in a form of UBI to help with the impacts of the coronavirus crisis, with a broader ambition for it to become permanent. So could it work here? Should it be adopted more widely? Well, I'm hoping our speaker can shed some light on all of this. He's a professorial research associate in the Department of Development Studies at SOAS and a founder of the Basic Income Earth Network, which is an NGO promoting basic income as a right. Good evening and welcome, Professor Guy Standing. Hello.
Good evening. Nice to be here.
Whereabouts
many of the things I was going to say. That's a good idea.
Oh, well, I hope not. I don't intend to steal your thunder. Where are you speaking to us from, Guy?
I'm speaking from a village outside Geneva where I live because for many years I worked in the United Nations, and I've been promoting basic income for nearly 40 years, and I've been involved in many pilots around the world, so we'll be able to talk about those during this discussion.
And just briefly, before we get into the meaty stuff, is lockdown describe what lockdown's like where you are?
Well, we're in our 5th week, or maybe it's the 6th week, and it's interesting what effect it's having on people's livelihoods, the way we live. It's changing And I think it's going to make permanent changes in the way many of us want to live. And I'll come back to some of those issues later in my talk.
Well, I'll let you get on with it because there's lots to talk about. Let's hear from you. There'll be a chance to ask questions at the end. Guy, over to you.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm going to be brief because we want to have a Q&A. As I've just mentioned, I've been working on this for many, many years. And I wrote a book last year that came out where I traced basic income back to the Charter of the Forest of November the 6th, 1217. And the point of doing so is that that charter came out at the same time as the Magna Carta, same day, and it basically established a right to subsistence of every free man and woman eventually as well. And the idea of it was that a right to subsistence in the commons. The commons are an essential part of society. And the book that I brought out last year, which is called Plunder of the Commons, is a contextual background to my talk this evening, because what we have seen, particularly in the austerity era, is a systematic plundering of the social fabric which makes up our commons, which has made the situation today much more fragile and potentially terrifying than it should have been. That's the background context. The second point I want to make is the justification for a basic income is fundamentally ethical, not economic. It's ethical in three senses. First, it's a matter of common justice. If you accept private inheritance of wealth, which is a lot of something for nothing, then you should accept that all of us, every one of us, our income and wealth is far more to do with the efforts of the many generations before us than anything we do ourselves. If you allow for private inheritance, then in a sense, a basic income is a sort of social dividend on the collective wealth that our ancestors produced. But I don't know whose ancestors, you don't know whose ancestors produced our wealth. So therefore, ethically, it's a matter of having a share, a dividend. The second ethical reason is that the basic income, if properly implemented, enhances freedom. Enhances the ability to say no to exploitative employers or landlords or oppressive spouses or partners. And it also strengthens liberal freedom, the freedom to be moral. You can't be moral, you can't have moral decision-making capacities if you are chronically insecure. And that leads to the third ethical reason. Basic security is a public good. You having it doesn't deprive me of having it. And we all need basic security to be able to function and be good people. And it turns out that being basically secure is a fundamentally good thing for psychological reasons and for productive reasons and for political reasons. I'll come back to that shortly. So the ethical reasons are strong, but now we're in a situation where not only ethical reasons are out there, but it's become an economic imperative. And I'll tell you why. The second contextual book that I produced is called The Corruption of Capitalism. I wanted to call it what it's about, which is rentier capitalism. In the past 30 years, very briefly, what has happened is that far from having a free market economy, we've morphed into a situation where the returns to property, physical property, financial property, intellectual property, have shot out of all proportion to the returns to work and labor. And that is a background context because what I've been writing about in the last 15 years is the growth of the precariat. I produced a book in 2011 called The Precariat, the New Dangerous Class. It's been translated into 24 languages and led to me being all over the world talking to people who say, I am part of the precariat. And that is a very important aspect of the debate around basic income today. Now, the latest book, which came out in late March, ironically, by coincidence, was written saying that essentially what rentier capitalism has produced is a threat to the good society that we would all like to see built. And the reason it's a threat is that it's created a uniquely fragile economic system in which we have seen the emergence of 8 giants. Now, the sense of being a giant draws on William Beveridge's famous report of 1942, which set the scene for the design of the welfare states in the post-war era. He talked about 5 giants: disease, ignorance, idleness, squalor, and want. My book says that we have 8 modern giants that are blocking the way to a good society. The first of those giants is inequality. We have higher levels of inequality today than at any time with recorded statistics. And the wealth inequality is much greater than income inequality. And wealth relative to income has increased dramatically from 300% of national income to 700%. And 60% of all wealth in Britain today is inherited wealth. Now, in that situation, this inequality means that an enormous number of people are actually in the precariat, precariously living with all the problems I'll come to. The second giant is insecurity. We have chronic levels of insecurity, not just in Britain, but all over the world, but very strongly built up in Britain. Huge numbers of people feel on the edge, chronically insecure, and it's characterized by uncertainty. Uncertainty is unknown unknowns. You don't know what's going to happen to you. You can't predict it. It could happen to any of us. And that uncertainty feeds into the third giant. The third giant is debt. We have the highest level of private debt in our history today. It's frighteningly high, and it's all over the world, it's high, but in Britain, it's astronomically high. I've given the statistics in the book. And this debt and insecurity and inequality contributes to the fourth giant. The fourth giant is stress. And I'm talking about the situations before the pandemic hit. Stress is a pandemic itself. We have huge proportions of people who feel stressed, and then they suffer the social illnesses and the cardiac problems and the suicidal tendencies that I've documented in the book. Stress is a terrible giant. The fifth giant I've called precarity. Precarity is not the same as insecurity. Precarity is a feeling that you're living bits and pieces lives and you're not going anywhere, you don't have any sense of control, you feel like a supplicant, you're losing rights. That's how the precariat feel. The sixth giant are those robots. People fear automation, they fear being made redundant. I don't believe that's quite right, but it's certainly extremely disruptive, all this technological change, and makes people fearful, and it contributes to inequality. But it's the seventh giant that I thought in the book, unless we were having a big crash, that I thought would tip the balance and lead to millions more people supporting basic income. And that is extinction. The sense of pollution, the sense of ecological collapse rushing towards us. And the basic income can help deal with the threat of extinction because we need ecological taxes. We need carbon taxes. But you can't have carbon taxes without giving carbon dividends because carbon taxes by themselves would increase inequality. We need them, but we need to get popular support. And the only way to do that is to say all the revenue gathered from carbon taxes and other ecological taxes will be in some way recycled to give part of the money for a long-term basic income. We do that, we see it in Switzerland, There's a carbon tax, a wealth tax, which is recycled to people. And the eighth giant is the one the politicians are beginning to worry about, and quite right too. And that is the threat of neo-fascist populism. It was behind Donald Trump. Look what we've got. It was behind Brexit. Look what we're getting. It's the behind of the growth of populist authoritarian governments in various parts of Europe that are really threatening. So we have these eight giants, and then the pandemic strikes. You could call it the ninth giant or the trigger, like the killing of the Archduke of Austria in August 1914 was the trigger to the First World War, but not the cause of it. Now, the pandemic should be compared with the Spanish flu of exactly 100 years ago. The Spanish flu ended up killing probably 50 million people around the world. But it was not followed by an economic slump. We are going to see an economic slump this time. And that's because at that time, private debt was relatively low, less than 50% of GDP in the United States. Corporate debt was non-existent, and the financialization was not excessive. This time, when just before the pandemic struck, private debt in the United States was 150% of GDP, of national income. That's higher than it was in the worst time of the Great Depression in the 1930s. Now, if you have a small downturn, we're having a big demand shock, a big downturn, and you've got that level of debt, and corporate debt is 3/4 of GDP, then suddenly you're going to see a spiraling of bankruptcies, a spiraling of homelessness where people can't service their debts. They're going to be out in the street, and they're going to be starving, and we're going to see many more suicides. All of these things are coming, happening as we talk and listen. This fragility that we've got leads to us saying, well, how do we respond? We've seen governments, just after the financial crash in 2008, the first thing they did was bolster the banks and the financiers and the financial markets, pouring in billions of dollars, pounds, euros into the financial markets, enriching the financiers and the financial communities so that their incomes were higher several years afterwards, whereas living standards for the majority were down. The same sort of reaction has taken place so far this time, but I don't think we will allow them to go further down that line. The Chancellor has introduced measures that I've characterized in an article in the Financial Times 10 days ago as the most regressive social policy in my lifetime. And I'm getting on. But the most frightening thing about the job retention scheme is that it's giving high income earners 80% of their income on condition that they don't do any work, whereas somebody in the precariat is either being missed out altogether or gets 80% of £500. So you're giving a high income earner 5, 6, 7 times as much as you're giving a low income earner. And for those who are on universal credit, you get an extra £80 a month, as long as they continue to look for work. So you've got perverse incentives and regressiveness, and it's coming at a huge cost. They estimate that it's going to cost £40 billion between March and May, and then it's going to be continued, so it's going to cost another 10 billion. If you'd use the same money to give everybody a basic income, we could have had a very decent basic income for everybody. Don't ever let them kid you that we can't afford it. In my books, I've shown how the various ways of affording it, and we'll come back to that maybe in the questions. But the advantages of having a basic income, as we've shown in pilots in India, in Africa, in Canada, in California, even in Britain, the advantages are huge and undeniable. In every single pilot, and I've summarized the evidence in the books, in every pilot, paying a basic income has improved nutrition and health. It's reduced stress. It's resulted in more work, not less. Listen to me again. More work, not less. Contrary to the prejudices of the Ian Duncan Smiths of the world, who say, oh, we can't give a basic income because they would all become lazy. He's got much more than a basic income. I wish he would become a little more lazy, and then we'd have less of his universal credit. But the findings are that people who have a basic income, have basic security, are more altruistic. They do more work that is not labor. They do more care work. They do more work on their allotments or on their enthusiasms, on their care for their community. And they slow down a bit in their mind because they feel they have greater sense of control. And I believe one of the silver linings in a very dark cloud of this lockdown will be that more people will appreciate the value of caring for others and having the capacity to do that and wanting to be creative in ways that are not in bullshit jobs, excuse me. And we will realize that many of the jobs that people are forced to do, we can do without. We can automate them very good. I don't think it's a great achievement to have a whole lot of people cleaning toilets and cleaning things that we could automate. So I think the essence of the debate around basic income is going to change. We will see many sufferings in the wake of this pandemic. And we need to change our thinking and our societal values. But we will only get a basic income system, and you have to have supplements for people with disabilities and people who've got frailties and things because they have extra costs and lower opportunities. So it's only an anchor of a new income distribution system. But we can do it. And I'm getting a deluge of emails and contacts from around the world because people around the world are seeing this as an essential part of the recovery and an essential way, and this I think is a key word, essential way of giving us all resilience. Resilience means that we can withstand shocks. We can deal with hazards. We can respond with altruism, with tolerance of the other. And I think that it will help. It's not a panacea. It's got to go with other things, but I think it's absolutely essential today. Thank you very much for listening. Ritula?
Thank you very much, Guy. So much to talk about there, and I hope we can unpack it in the next half an hour. If you're listening and watching online, do put your questions onto the Zoom chat and we can try and incorporate them. But let's begin, first of all, Guy, by thinking about how this is viewed by the left. So I know that you spoke to John McDonnell and he was quite keen on thinking about a UBI, but that wasn't, the party wasn't elected, it didn't go ahead. Keir Starmer, though, has said that creating an entirely new social security system is unlikely to be possible during this crisis. Is that the difficulty? People might think it's a good idea, but when it might seem perhaps urgent in the way that you've outlined, actually there isn't the bandwidth to go ahead and do it.
Well, first of all, I was an economic advisor to John McDonnell for 3 years, and I worked closely with him. He's a friend, and he agreed and he commissioned me to write a report saying that if elected, Labour would introduce pilots in various places. And there were various parts of Britain. Liverpool City Council voted, and I went up and spoke there, Coventry, Sheffield, Hull, and a few other places, and in Scotland, 4 places. So there were going to be pilots in local areas. I was disappointed with what he has said, and I thought it was rather ironic because, as you just quoted him, the statement by itself, if you think about it, is ridiculous, because that is precisely what the government is doing, introducing an entirely new system. I mean, you can't have a more different system than what they've introduced compared with the past. So to say that we can't introduce a new system is ridiculous, because that's what they're doing. What I find disappointing in his statement is he's going along in alliance with the government, with what they're doing. So is the TUC. And basically the government has done what the TUC was advocating, and the Labour Party said before the Chancellor introduced it. So they're all in this wage subsidy scheme. And it protects the insiders. It protects the PAYE employees, what we call C1, C2 employees, but not the precariat. It doesn't reach the precariat. The TUC doesn't reach the precariat. And the Labour Party, I think, has gone back to being a labourist party, somehow feeling that jobs are the pedestal and that everything has to be linked to jobs. I hope that the people in the Labour Party who came to the launch of my report last May, who spoke up passionately in favour of basic income, Ed Miliband, John McDonnell, Margaret Greenwood, Clive Lewis, and various others who are in the shadow cabinet now, I hope they will find their voice. Because the Green Party is in favour, the Liberal Democrats will be coming out, the Scottish National Party is in favour, Plaid Cymru is in favour. So we'll soon find that we have a whole range of political parties, and a lot of Labour MPs, and Caroline Lucas, who's came to launch with the book, a lot of people are in favour now.
Okay, so that's the, if you like, the political backdrop. Let's just think about it. Imagine those trials had gone ahead. How much would you advocate a UBI should be in the UK per month? And in a sense, what in your mind would it cover? What basic needs would it cover?
Well, what I've said is, I've always asked this question, and I get asked it all over the world. What would you have it in Hong Kong? What would you have it in India? And so on. I don't think you can actually answer in an ideal sense. What I think is important is to move in the direction of a good basic income. So to start with, what I've suggested in the book, I said, if you just had a base, a very, very modest base while you develop the system of £100, £150 per each individual adult, right? Then you could build it up as you built up the funds for it. Now, the funding of it is actually not that difficult as a starter system. We have a terrible situation in this country where personal income tax allowance is costing 120 billion pounds a year, whatever it might be exactly. But if you converted that, you could start by paying every adult £50, okay? We have, in addition, the Treasury figures, which I cite in the book, the Treasury figures, not my figures. We find that tax reliefs and subsidies that go mainly to affluent people and corporations, according to the Treasury estimates, there are 1,156 of those, and the top 209 for which they can calculate cost the Treasury £430 billion a year. Many of those things have no justification economically. We could convert a lot of that into being able to pay for a basic income, then you can get up to £150, and that's beginning to give people a base. But last point on your question, I did a calculation that 1 in every 3 private tenants in Britain today, and they've paid their rent and they paid their food, have less than £25 a week left for all other expenditure. So if you're giving an extra £50, for someone like that, that is a huge help in getting control of your debt or whatever it might be.
To pick up though on your basic idea that this is a way in which the very poorest suddenly have a much more sure, a certain kind of level of income, does it also though, if you don't get the details right, doesn't it also give wealthy people a kind of moral get out of jail card free? Well, it's all right, we've given them a basic income, how much we earn doesn't really matter now.
Well, let me go back to the point about not giving it to the wealthy, to the starting point in answer to your question. What we have in Britain is a means-tested system. In other words, over the last 30 years, more and more schemes have been saying, we will give you help only if you can show you're poor. And then, of course, just to counter for the thought that maybe you're poor because you're lazy, they introduce behavior tests and sanctions and checks and all of that stuff. Well, this creates what are called poverty traps. And the poverty trap in Britain means that if you try to go from getting the benefits into a low-wage job that the precariat could get, you face a marginal tax of over 80%. That's what the Department of Work and Pensions estimates. So in other words, you would only get 20% of any extra money that you actually earn. But it's worse than that in Britain because you have this waiting period of 5 weeks now, it used to be 6, and it actually in reality is more like 12 weeks. So if you took a short-term job, you'd very quickly be back in the queue and you would lose altogether. So there is a huge disincentive. Now the question you were adding to is that, of course, we can tax back from the wealthy by various means so that they don't gain or lose out of it. But also, you know, people who are insecure, people who are locked out of the mainstream of society, have very weak bargaining position and are terrified. If people have a sense of basic security, they'll stand up for their rights much more. They will defend the social institutions. It's all very well to say, yes, but they can just have it and we walk away. That's what they've been doing. That's why we have our libraries being closed. That's why our parks were being run down. That's why in many cities and towns of Britain, we don't have police stations. The medical services were run down. All of those things happened. So to say a basic income would cause it, I don't think makes sense. That was happening.
So do you assume, though, in your definition of a basic income, that there would be a strong public sector alongside it? Because there are those on the right who might say, well, if we give everybody a basic income, and I think this has been argued in the past, it's a way of the state, in a sense, withdrawing from society.
Look, the analogy I give is you can't win a game of golf with only one club, right? You have to have strong organizations. You have to have strong organizations demanding a good social state. I'm not afraid of that debate, right? We can defend our public services and we can defend it much more if we all have security. That's my point. And the libertarians on the far right are a bunch of nutcases, and I'm quite happy to argue with them from a position of morality, from politics, and we need a good social state. That is a different argument, and it seems to me it's a non sequitur, because the reasoning for having a basic income is the reasoning for having a basic income. And that is only one golf club, if you like, but it's a very vital golf club.
You begin from considering ideas like inequality, fairness, sort of social justice, but there would be those who would say, well, hang on a minute, anything that you give has got to include an element of work. And certainly politically over the years, that's how politicians have addressed the kind of the issue of how to pay benefits. So you had working family tax credits, or Bill Clinton's welfare reforms, or even Nixon, considered the idea of some kind of basic income, but it was always attached to work, and the furlough scheme that you've discussed. Isn't that a kind of a difference of approach, a fundamental difference of political approach, where you begin from?
Well, I want anybody who says what you just said, I want anybody to answer me the following question. Okay, if you take that position, you must be in favor of abolishing all private inherited wealth. You must, because you haven't done a day's work to get that. I mean, the Duke of Buccleuch, I like to give this the argument because it's got a lovely name it brings. The Duke of Buccleuch inherited 277,000 acres of prime land in Britain. You know why he got that? Because he happened to be the 10th descendant of an illegitimate child of Charles II. And in addition to his 277,000, he's received, I don't know, about 10 million from the government to help him keep his 277,000 acres. When I hear that they should not receive anything for not doing any work, they didn't do any work. The same with Ian Duncan Smith. He inherits through his wife 1,500 acres of lovely land, and he gets huge subsidies from the government for not working on it at all. He's received over £2 million. So we have a system which is hypocritical. For those people saying that, I want to hear them say, I'm in favor of abolishing all private inherited wealth. Then I'll take them serious.
Okay, so in your opinion, and this is a question from Gavin White, what's the best argument against universal basic income?
Well, you can guess my answer to that is that I don't think there is a good one. In my book called Basic Income, I took the 19 most common criticisms of basic income, and I tried to answer all those 19. When you've been working on a subject as long as I have, you've got to the point where you've heard those arguments again and again, and you think you've got good answers. I think the most common is this effect on work, which I think is becoming clearer that it's wrong, but that's the most common. And I will often talk with a politician and talk for half an hour. They start with saying, well, it'll have disincentive to work. You'll explain why it doesn't. And he'll end up saying, okay, I get it. And then 3 months later, you'll meet him and he'll say the same thing. It's something ingrained in the consciousness.
Well, we do value work, don't we? We see it as part of our identity. And in a sense, it's an inheritance wrapped up in that idea that people see inheritance as a product of work, of past work.
No, they don't. That illegitimate child was a long way back. I mean, they don't. That's a specious argument. I think, Ritula, that the realization is this: for most ordinary human beings, work is not the same thing as labor. A famous economist in 1922, Arthur Pigou, said, if he hires a woman as a housekeeper or a cook, national income goes up, employment goes up, and he could have added, and the politicians will be boasting that jobs have gone up. Right? If he then marries her and she continues to do precisely the same work, national income goes down, employment goes down, the unemployment rate goes up, and those politicians keep quiet. The sense of work is something fundamental. I have a basic income, I hope. It doesn't stop me working. I want to work. I thrive on work. I want to be productive. And what happens is that when people have basic security, they want to work and they want to be more productive and they want to develop their lives for their children, for their families, for their communities. And this pandemic will teach people, it's teaching all of us, I hope, that the value of unpaid care work is the most valuable work in society. Why is it all unpaid? Why is it not compensated? Why does a poor woman who hasn't got an income, doesn't have a partner probably, has to work looking after a child without being compensated? We are now going to recalibrate what we mean by work. And the most valuable forms of work will suddenly be on the top of our minds. And that, I think, is how it should be.
related to this, Kate Hind asks, you characterize the case for a UBI as a moral choice, but how strong is the economic case? How does the cost of UBI compare to the cost of the existing welfare system and wider state and social benefits for better health and a reorientated workforce?
Well, I think first of all, Kate, is it, who was just asked this question? We shouldn't fall into the trap of being told basic income is an alternative to X or Y. Shouldn't fall into that trap. You can easily fall into the trap and say, should we give a basic income or pay more for the National Health Service? My answer is we should do both, right? We should be finding the funds to be able to have a stronger National Health Service and to be paying everybody a basic income. I don't want the either or thing. I could give tit for tat and say, well, should we give basic income or spend on Trident? You know, and then more people would say, oh, we'll have basic income rather than Trident. But that would be also a characterization. What we can say is that there is fiscal space. And fiscal space for using it for paying for progressive social policy rather than regressive would lower inequality, which would be good for society. It would lower insecurity, ditto. It would lower the stress. It would enable people to be more in control of paying their debts. And it would enable people to have less sense of precarity. And deal with ecological threat by being able to do more work that is resource preserving rather than resource depleting. So we've got a number of factors that are associated positively with basic income. And we can say, look, we should be taxing wealth. It's a ridiculous situation that even though wealth is 700% of our national income, only less than 4% of total tax revenue comes from taxes on wealth. It is ridiculously small. Most countries have a wealth tax. Britain does not. Even a 1% wealth tax would pay for a modest basic income.
Oh,
if you ask me the alternative, I can give you the answer.
What's the alternative?
The alternative is I'd put the 1% tax on wealth to pay income, rather than not have the 1%.
Jules Bristow.
But I would like a carbon tax and a digital data tax. I've laid out the different levies that I think we need.
I'd like to come back to the idea of a carbon tax, but Jules Bristow says you've made the case which persuades those of us on the left who share your principles, but how do you persuade those on the right who will only be convinced by an economic argument for basic income?
Yeah, well, I think that's very interesting because I'm about to lose several friends listening, I suspect. But for some peculiar reason, for 3 years in a row, I've been asked to speak about the precariat and basic income in Davos. And as everybody who knows about these things knows, that's the corporate elite and the right and the rest of it. So when I was first invited up there, I was very surprised and disinclined to go, but I went. And it's interesting that many people on the right, the sensible right, not the libertarian nutters, but the people who are sort of corporate business types, you know, they came, some billionaires were in the audience, and basically they want a sustainable market economy. And just like Milton Friedman, who came and joined our network shortly before he died, maybe joining caused the death, but they understand that if people don't have basic security, they can't make rational choices. And for them, people must be able to make rational choices about what type of work they do, what sort of skills they pursue, what sort of consumption, what sort of strategy. And if you make people chronically insecure, they tend to vote for populists like Donald Trump and fascists who say the problem is them, the other, the migrants, the Muslims, the Jews, or whatever they want to demonize. We won't listen to them if we have basic security. Psychologists have shown us that people who are basically secure are more altruistic, they're more tolerant, and they're more likely to vote in a moderate way. And those people who came, and I've been invited to Silicon Valley as well, they listen and basically they say, well, you know, that would be a sensible way of sharing it. And a number of them have said, we know we're winning too much. We know that we're getting far too much relative to what everybody else is getting. It's ridiculous. And I think enough of those sensible people on the political right of center are open to that. I had a big public debate with Vince Cable a couple of weeks ago, and he'd written an article extremely hostile to basic income in The Independent. So when I was asked to speak to the city financiers about it, they said, well, who do you suggest as a counterpoint? And I said, well, Vince Cable, go for it, you see. And he then read my book, and he came on the program. I thought he was going to give me a really tough time, but he suddenly said, well, I've come around and I now support the idea of pilots. I think it should be piloted. And I felt like sort of saying, is this the same Vince Cable who wrote the article? So I do think we can't convert the bigots. No, all bigots on extreme right or extreme left. But I think a lot more people are seeing it within the vision of their good society. And we've got to put pressure. We've got to give the politicians something better than a spaghetti backbone, which they have at the moment.
So if people are looking for proof, for evidence, Emily McIver asks, is UBI working anywhere?
Well, we've done pilots, and big pilots, where we provided thousands of people with basic income. And we've done what are called randomized control trials. In other words, we gave 6,000 people basic income, individual, modest amounts, no conditions, in cash. And we compared it with 6,000 people who were not receiving the basic income. We did this pilot in India, and we did it over 2 years. And the results in the end showed that the people who were receiving basic income improved their health, their nutrition, their schooling, women's status, work, income. All right. We found the similar things in Africa. We found similar things in Canada and findings in North Carolina and so on. And then moving towards a basic income, I'm often asked, which country do you think will be the first to introduce it? Well, in Alaska, they've had what's effectively a basic income for all residents since 1982. They created a fund called the Alaska Permanent Fund, and it's built up, and it pays out a dividend each year to every resident. And the results have been a reduction in inequality and improvement of lifestyles, and very positive results. But today, and you asked me this question, today, the first country, and maybe the second actually, country to introduce a basic income in the pandemic is Malawi. I would never have guessed that. They've introduced so that every resident of Malawi will be getting a monthly basic income. But in other countries, they're moving in this direction. Even in the United States, and Canada's very actively thinking about it, and other countries are too.
But pilots are one thing, actually doing it for real is another. I mean, Finland comes to mind, where they went ahead with it for 2 years. They thought people were happier at the end, but it didn't seem to get people back to work, or it didn't seem to change much, and then they abandoned it. So does it suggest that it's good, but perhaps not good enough, not as transformational as perhaps you'd like to suggest?
Well, what you've just said, I don't know where you got that information, but you're not the first to say it. It was complete nonsense, to be with respect. What they did in Finland, and I was an advisor, so I worked with the government from the beginning. It was a 2-year pilot. It began and ended exactly on time. So it wasn't abandoned at all. Wasn't abandoned. Was not abandoned. Okay?
Wasn't carried on though.
The trouble was that the way it was designed was not a basic income. Okay? What they did is they gave a monthly amount to 2,000 unemployed scattered around the country. Okay? Only if they were unemployed. Okay? And they gave them that money instead of the conditional benefits that they'd been receiving before. They got 560 euros equivalent okay? And then they monitored what happened. What happened is that having that money compared with being told they've got to be job searching, made absolutely no difference to whether they looked for jobs or took jobs or worked. In fact, many of the people did a lot of extra work that weren't in jobs. They started up self-employed things, craftsman things, and so on. And at the end, as you say, it showed that the people receiving the money had much less stress, much better feelings about life and the rest of it. But it wasn't a proper basic income. A proper basic income is everybody in the community. You, me, everybody in the community gets a basic income, and you have network effects. If everybody gets it, then you tend to be, when somebody's in distress, there's more helping out. When somebody improves, they share it. But if you only give it to a few people in a community, very quickly others come knocking on their door and say, I want a share of that. So you don't have a proper basic income system. And that's why I never use the term universal. And I always try and use the term basic income system, because it must be in the whole community and it must be paid individually. One of the very interesting things about a basic income paid individually is that it improves the status and powers of women. In this pandemic, we are seeing a horrifying rise in domestic violence. Insecure people tend to resort to violence of different sorts. Some of the pilots that I summarize in the books led to criticisms from the right because it appeared to show family breakups. And then they said, yeah, you're giving basic income, these are leading to people breaking up families. When further research was done, it was about women leaving abusive relationships. They had their basic income. They were able to walk out of a relationship that they had only tolerated because they needed the financial help from a partner. That's a positive benefit that I think will be appreciated as the rise in domestic violence that we're witnessing or hearing about is seen. And I like that, because in the pilots we've done, it's the women who've benefited more than men.
I'm really conscious of the time. There's so much more we could talk about just in this sort of small area. There's so much to talk about, but we talked about decarbonisation, and Pamela Buchanan asks, how can UBI support a move to a decarbonised economy?
Well, I think I discussed this in terms of the extinction. I think we need those carbon taxes. We need ecological taxes. I've proposed 17, including, this was before the pandemic had the effect that it's having, cruise liner levies, because they are the most polluting. Levies on billboards that are polluting the visual atmosphere. Various types of incursions in our commons is where we should focus our tax. To do that, consistent with a common justice perspective, it's only good if everybody benefits. At the moment, the polluters are mainly the rich. The polluters are causing damage to the community and to the poor, because the poor are affected more adversely by pollution. If we had carbon taxes and we recycled through ways I've suggested in the books, through a commons fund, that you build up the fund like the Norwegians have done, paying out to everybody equally, basically you are recycling. Now, how does that help with the ecology? First, you are tackling the direct causes of pollution, global warming, and loss of the species. But second, you're giving us, you, me, the others, the capacity to do work that is not labor, to do care work, to do community work, to do volunteering, to do the work preserving our environment. We have a system here where we, once or twice a year, we all go out clearing the woods. That's work. You don't get paid for it. But to me, if we make it possible for all of us to be able to spend a little bit more time, and that feeds through to something you began the talk early this evening. The first attempt at basic income was in ancient Greece from Pericles, who believed that for being a citizen, for participating in the life of the polis, for voting on different subjects of public concern, the citizen should be compensated by a sort of basic income. Now, of course, their society was riddled with class and sexism and, you know, all the rest of it. But the principle I like, in the sense that it would encourage us to spend more time in our politics, learning how to be a public citizen. The trouble is, most of us don't have enough time to spend learning about what are the issues. How many people knew all about the nature of what Brexit meant before they rushed because they listened to jingoistic one-liners, lies from both sides? I'm not trying to make a particular point there, but the problem is we don't have the time and the energy and inclination to learn how to be proper citizens. And I think a basic income will help with that.
Wouldn't a cynic simply say, though, you don't know what people are going to spend that money on? You take a very optimistic view, but they could spend it on drugs. They could spend it on any kind of, anything they chose to. You wouldn't have a say. It wouldn't necessarily go towards doing good works and making the world a better place.
Well, the cynics would say that. When we were about to do our pilots in India, Sonia Gandhi herself asked us to a house because we were about to do it. And she said, they're going to waste their money. They'll spend it on tobacco and alcohol and just complete waste, doing nothing. Then when we've done the results and we produced our report and book, she asked us back and she said she'd wished she knew. Okay. Every pilot has shown that people try to improve their lives and the lives of their children. And I think social policy should be based on trust, not the minority. It should be based on what you think the majority, what you and me would do. If I gave you a basic income when you didn't have it, and you have a small child, you telling me you wouldn't be spending it to improve the life of your child? That's how people react. And all the pilots and the psychological experiments have shown that if you give people security, they behave better. They start to do things. And how much evidence we want, if you distrust humanity, then you're always going to be a cynic. I don't want to listen. But we are not cynics. The human condition is we all want to improve the lives of ourselves, our community, our loved ones, learn the dignity. So we must have a vision of society that is ultimately based on believing that the human species is basically good. And that's why it survived so long.
And that's a fantastically optimistic note on which to end. It's a rather uplifting thought. Thank you very much, Guy Standing. That was so interesting and lots to think about. Thank you to everyone who's been watching for all your great questions. Agile Rabbit's currently arranging more online events and they'll be released shortly. Go to the website agile-rabbit.com and there are also podcasts of previous events there. But for now, thank you very much to all of you. Thank you, Guy Standing.